Alrighty, well, welcome back to Caffeinated Flicks. I'm Celeste,
And I'm Kenzie.
and today we are going to be covering Hellboy.
It's a 2004 movie from April.
Oh, Kenzie, you didn't tell us what you're drinking today.
Well, you kind of just went right into the movie.
I did.
I was like, I don't know what else to do with that.
Dad. First, exactly.
Coffee first. Coffee first. So I decided to stop by Dunkin' Donuts and I got myself a matcha, a large iced matcha with coconut milk and 2 shots of coconut. So it's extra coconutty.
2 shots of coconut. Is that
Yeah, yeah, but it's unsweetened, so it's not actually sweet, which is great. So it just gives like a coconut flavor.
how is Dunkin's matcha? I've never before.
I hadn't had it before either, but in comparison to like Starbucks's matcha, it's not sweet. So I really enjoy that.
Oh yeah, because theirs is Starbucks is definitely really sweet, which I love.
Yeah.
But I would expect Dunkin's to be super sweet, honestly.
I know. I'm a little shocked because generally when I get things from Dunkin', like the flavor's stronger and it's generally sweeter. So it's not sweet at all, which is lovely. And then, of course, if you get the unsweetened flavors, then it's not sweet still, but you still get like the added flavor. Like my favorite go tos are the coconut and almond. But what about you?
Oh my gosh. So right now I'm drinking water because this morning,
Lame.
I know, I decided to DoorDash coffee this morning.
Ooh,
I got
what'd you get?
desperate. I know. It was $5,
Oh,
but
okay.
it was awful. Like
Yeah.
the room came half empty. When I went to like open to pick up my order, there was a trail of coffee down my walkway. And then I opened up the bag and it was a puddle of coffee. So I spent the morning cleaning my kitchen.
Oh my gosh. That's awful.
It's the worst start to the morning.
Right? You're already desperate. And then
I'm
all of a sudden your
so
coffee comes.
salty. I know.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But yeah, so no coffee for me today, unfortunately. I have to go to the
Well,
store and get
yes, because you only drink cold coffee anyway.
except when it's like freezing out. And again, I'm desperate. Then I'll settle for coffee. But
Oh, I love it. Well, cools. Now that we've actually done our coffee,
I know.
we get in. So we're covering 2004's Hellboy, directed by Guillermo Del Toro. And I apologize for my pronunciation. I
No,
am
that was
extremely white.
beautiful.
Okay. I always get very concerned about, especially rolling my R's. As I think I've told you, Richard has told me that I have such a white girl accent when I try and speak Spanish. And I'm like, I don't know what to do about that because I'm very white.
Right, but it's important that you try. I think that's what matters. Is that
I appreciate that. I appreciate that so much. It was nominated and won several different awards. Some of the ones that I think are really funny is like it was nominated for Teen Choice Award of 2004 for drama and action.
see
Mhm.
that?
And then have you ever heard of this award? There's an award called a Bram Stoker Award.
Bram Stoker. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, like the writer of Dracula.
I'm nope. Is that the writer of Dracula? Bram Stoker?
Bram
Why
Stoker
would
wrote
he have won
Dracula.
that award?
I don't know, but it was nominated for screenplay. It's wild.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
So, as we break into the cast, some of the casts are really well known. So, Ron Perlman is in this movie as Hellboy, which you would never be able to tell considering how much makeup he has on. And then you've got Selma Blair. I think this is at like her peak hotness, if you will.
Yes, gorgeous.
And then we've got Doug Jones. And Doug Jones is really well known and he works really closely with Guillermo del Toro in a lot of the monster
I was about to
aspects.
say, I feel like maybe he played like in like I don't want to say like those mama movies. Have you seen them? And it's okay, like the scary mother with the long arms and do you know what I'm talking about? He looks like the type of person that would play those kind of characters.
It sounds like the character in Barbarian, like But for instance, like he was in the other Hellboy, The Shape of Water. He was the fish man in Shape of Water. He's the fish man in Hellboy. He was in Pan's Labyrinth as the fawn, and he was in several other things. He was also Billy Butcherson in Hocus Pocus 2, the latest one.
Oh, I'm not a Hocus Pocus fan.
I don't know if we can continue our friendship.
That was the end.
That's the end of this. It ended before we could begin. All right, we must move on. Otherwise, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. So then we've also got John Hurt, Rupert Evans, Geralt Roden, and then Jeffrey Tambor. Jeffrey Tambor is one of those actors who finds his
Oh,
way into just about everything.
pretty much, yeah. I remember him in this.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. He was like the head FBI dude, but we'll get into that. But yeah, so it's so funny just to see him in so many different things from Arrested Development to Meet Joe Black and of course in Hellboy now. And he's kind of a jack of all trades, you know, a chameleon
Yeah.
of sorts. So cool. Shall we get into the ratings?
Yes. So for the 10 out of 10 rating, oh my, uh,
Did the puppies get into something?
no, they're deciding to play right next to me. And then when they're deciding to bark.
Oh, how rude. It's like they don't even care that we're trying to record a podcast.
Can you hear that?
Not really. I mean, I heard a little bit of a scuffle, but that was about it.
Oh, okay. I will go ahead and go over the 10 out of 10 rating. So it is, I grew up loving this movie a lot. I was around 12 at the time and missed the chance to see it in theaters. I just know for several years I was obsessed with the movie. The directing is great, brilliant lines, and fun vibes. All Del Toro. Oh my God, now I can't even say his name. Guillermo Del Toro. I feel pressure. Created a special experience that is easy to love. Perlman is perfect for this role. I crave his take on main role of Hellboy. Lots of lore mashed in only thing. What does that even mean? Lots
I don't
of
know.
lore mashed in only thing. I can't. That really make is better for this R rating. Watching it again without seeing for at least 5 years or so makes me realize how much I appreciate the movie. Such a gem in cinema.
The 1 out of 10 rating says, "The title says it all. How could anyone like this garbage is beyond me. The movie took forever to pick up pace. It had too much talk and not enough action. Hellboy looked like he was wrapped in foam paint over the cheap red fingernail polish. Abe Sabian looked even cheesier, and Liz Sherman looked like a junkie instead of the love interest. The special effects were below average quality. The villains were such a waste of screen time since they didn't even convey enough character for the audience to even dislike them. To get at least part of my money's worth, I sat through the whole thing, unlike half of the audience which walked out. I lost 2 perfectly good hours of my life and $6 watching this monstrosity of a movie. Do yourself a favor and skip this garbage." That's quite harsh. And you know it was from a long time ago because
They're like,
clearly
oh,
it was $6 to see the movie.
that's the price that stood out to me. $6. Now minimum is like $12.
I know, and that's for a matinee.
Oh my God. Matinees don't even really exist anymore. They all
I know.
start like midday or afternoon.
I thought there was a matinee. Anything before like 5.
Oh, is anything but matinee was like in the morning, anything like before noon.
Oh, well, I guess we'll find out sometime.
Who knows? Day in a very long time.
I know, it's been so long. To be fair, I haven't been in the movies in a very long time. So, what is your history with Hellboy?
My history with Hellboy? I have no history with Hellboy. Like I said, when I rewatched it, I did not remember like any of it. And now I still can't tell you what happened in the movie.
Oh my gosh.
Sure what it is about this movie, but like I watch it and I just forget it immediately.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I used to love this movie. Like when it first came out, it was one of my favorite movies to just kind of rewatch.
It's an entertaining movie. Like it's I feel like it's a good time. So it's
Yeah.
super cool.
Well, cool. Shall we break into it?
Yes.
The movie opens with text on screen, and then we hear a disembodied voice that questions what makes a man a man. Is it nature or something else entirely? The disembodied voice continues to speak about the fact that it's during World War II. So that's the background setting for us. And the narrator is in Scotland as he's a paranormal advisor to Roosevelt in World War II.
So bizarre. And
Yeah, I think honestly, because this is based off of a comic book and it
I
was
was
based off,
thinking that.
yeah, it's based off of a comic book that came out, I think, probably near the 80s. And so with that, a lot of the 80s was all about the Red Scare and the Berlin Wall and the evil Nazis and evil Russians and whatnot. And so this movie and comic book kind of collaborated all of those together.
I guess in that sense makes sense.
Yeah. At that time, Hitler and the Nazis was much more common or closer in time frame
Mm,
than it is now.
I know, but even till this day, I feel like, World War II, that backstory is still used for a lot of films and TV shows.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. People love their war.
Still very common, yeah.
So anyway, our narrator we find out is a paranormal advisor to Roosevelt in World War II, and we are set in a rainy battlefield, presumably in Scotland, and we meet Professor Broom. He is talking to what I assume is a colonel, and he's trying to give this colonel some rosary beads for his safety, and the colonel just kind of balks at him. He's like, "We don't need that. It's fine." So the Americans then go down the landscape, continuing to be rained on, and they come upon a Nazi camp. In the Nazi camp, there is a person wearing a mask, and I'm going to consider him Iron Mask. I don't actually know what his character's name is, but I feel like Iron Mask is applicable. So he's in the Nazi camp itself. He's standing in the middle and he's standing in front of a large metal contraption. And from there, we're introduced to a couple in the same area. One of them is a female officer, and one of them is a very buff wrestler looking fellow who's absolutely shirtless and it's pouring rain. He basically gives the female officer a book and he says something along the lines of, I will always be with you. And they're clearly a couple. They're about to kiss, but then something happens and he has to go off. So then the wrestler man, who we do find out later is Rasputin, as in the Romanov Rasputin. And
And I
so it like
immediately thought of Anastasia when I saw it.
that is the best correlation to Rasputin that I think our generation has. So he is preaching about opening up a portal, and then the Iron Masked fellow attaches a large metal gauntlet to his hand. This gauntlet, it controls the metal contraption, and then it begins to whirl until a portal into space is opened. We then, as the audience, get a view into the portal, and we see a field of monsters that are capsulated in gems. So it's very Hercules reminiscent, where the Titans are capsulated in the volcano. These monsters are capsulated in what looks like a crystal gem in space. So the American military is watching all of this unfold, and the professor knows the implications of this. So he says that they have to stop them, basically because of the portal itself. An American soldier throws a grenade, and someone is launched into the portal, and we see them disintegrate. So we know that the portal is bad news bears. This is when a battle begins. The Americans are shooting at the Nazis are shooting at the Americans, and then we see that the Iron Masked fellow deploys metal swords that come out of his arms, and he just starts kicking ass. He almost kills Professor Broom, but somebody then throws a grenade right underneath the base of the metal contraption, and this blows it up. And then Rasputin is then sucked into the portal as it continues to disappear and is broken. The colonel says it's almost over, but the professor knows better and he completely disagrees. He knows that the portal has been open for too long and something might have come through. They're about to capture Iron Mask when he flees and he's nowhere to be found. So then the question is, where did they come from? Where did that something that probably came through come from? And there's a question about perhaps it was hell or something else. There's an evil in this place. And then the professor says that he saw Rasputin there tonight. So he knows it's extra bad news bears. The Americans and the professor then translate over to a mausoleum that's in the area. And suddenly there's a noise. And the gentleman who professor is with suddenly freaks out as he hears a noise, and then he starts to shoot at this very small red demon looking creature, and the Americans want to destroy it, but the professor says, hold on a second. So everybody just halts. They don't know exactly what this creature is. They know that it's bright red. It's got a massive club for a hand, and it's got little devil horns, but it looks kind of monkey-esque. And so they do refer to it as a red monkey. And the professor is not afraid of it at all. What cracks me up is that he then pulls out a candy bar and he draws the little demon looking monster down with the candy bar. And then he finally gets the demon to jump into his arms and he asks the soldiers for a blanket. He wraps up the demon in the blanket. And then one of my favorite lines, all of a sudden he's like, it's a boy.
Oh my, yeah. I was like, I was so shook at that. Like, how, first of all, they were like mocking him, the
Mhm.
fact that he was telling them to wear rosaries.
I
And then
know.
all of a sudden, they're so quick to like accept this devil child. Like,
I guess the professor's only persuasive in 1 or 2 categories,
no, yeah,
religion not being one of them. So then we get a scene change where it's probably the next day and the entire troop is getting ready for a photo. And all of a sudden, the demon is at front and center and they name him Hellboy. Hellboy would soon become the son of the professor because he was a child without parents and he was a person without children. So he's like, I'm going to go ahead and take care of this demon.
we'll just take it.
So this is where we get into the credit scene where we're introduced to the movie being Hellboy. And what I love about this is it is the traditional comic book credit scene where you've got newspaper clippings everywhere, you've got comic strips, radio broadcasts over it, questioning whether or not Hellboy actually exists. And this is how we're introduced to the movie itself. Basically, Hellboy is like the modern Loch Ness monster or Sasquatch or something like that.
Oh,
Then we get another scene change after we've been introduced to the movie itself, and we see a troop of people hiking on a very snowy mountain. Like it is a blizzard out in this mountain, and there are about 3 different people who are just hiking along the ridge line. And I'm like, that does not look safe.
no, of course not.
But they make it apparent that they're searching for something. One of them says that what you're looking for is in there, and he points to a cavern. Another one opens up a cryptic book. It looks like it could have been a religious text. It's in a different language. And then they enter into a sacred place. The guide who took the hikers into the sacred place says that they shouldn't be there and he just wants his gold so that way he can leave. So one of the travelers flicks basically a gold domino at him. And then as he goes to pick it up off the floor, we see a gentleman behind him that has all of a sudden a blade dispel from his arm and he kills the guide. So now we know that it's Iron Mask. And then we
Dollar. Trying to live.
aren't we all, there we're all just trying to make it through. So then the other traveler removes her mask and we find out that it's the woman from the beginning who was in love with Rasputin. And the blood from the guide starts to spill into circular grooves that are on the floor. And they all meet in one middle section where a puddle is created, and Rasputin all of a sudden is resurrected through this blood. Now we have a scene change, and we're in a clinical setting, and a nurse asks the doctor, did you tell him yet? And then we pan out into a room that's outside of the room where the doctors were, and we see an elderly man on the examination table putting his shirt back on. So we can assume that there's something wrong with him. He's probably drastically ill. And this man starts to walk outside of the building and he looks into a window where he sees a TV where a talk show is being displayed. On this talk show, this is where we meet our character. Jeffrey Tambor plays. His name is Manning. He's head of an FBI program and he works very closely with Hellboy and the professor to keep it all under wraps. But during this talk show, he's dispelling any of the myths about Hellboy and saying that none of that is real. There's no evidence for it. And the elderly man just kind of gives it a smile and goes on his way.
He's basically PR for
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. He's just trying to keep him out of the limelight. So then we come across a man on a motorcycle who shows up to a snowy mansion. He says that he's there from the FBI and that he's a transfer. A machine pops out and scans his eye, and then the gate opens and he drives in. Once he's inside, there's another FBI gentleman and he says that he's late and to watch his hands and elbows. From there, all of a sudden, the floor starts to lower, and the gentleman who was late then goes into a basement. And as he goes into this basement, he sees a large tank of water on his right side. And then he hears a voice ask him to turn the page. And this gentleman's very confused at first. And then he looks over at the tank itself, and a fish man shows up. And the FBI agent is then introduced to Professor Broom, who is the elder gentleman that we saw just a moment ago. Broom then begins to explain and introduce the fishman. This is Abe Sapien. And they explained that his name really means basically fishman. Abe Sapien. What?
I said Fishman was just too simple. They needed to
They needed to make it Latin. It's fine.
Oh yeah, there
So Abe starts to dispel what he knows about the agent. Basically, Abe can look at somebody or touch something and be able to get all of the information that he needs from that person or that object. And this will be a runner throughout the movie. Broom then explains that there are people who go after what goes bump in the night, and that is them. They then enter a room that has a whole bunch of artifacts, and Broom starts to walk him through the entire history. Then they reach a vault at the end of the hallway, and it's being guarded by a man who's another FBI agent who's very close to Hellboy. Broom then hands the previous FBI agent two baby Ruths. So this FBI agent, his name is John. His name is John Myers, to be specific. The gentleman who's protecting the vault, he says, be careful essentially. And John is very confused. He has absolutely no idea why he's here or what's happening or what it is that he's supposed to be protecting essentially. And so then the guard opens up the vault and says, meet the rest of the family. And then as they continue to walk through this room, he starts to then begin to explain that he, as in Hellboy, has a thing for cats. He never goes out unsupervised, and that John will basically be his nanny. Then a voice starts to say, I hate those comics, because John has picked up a Hellboy comic that was on his table, essentially. And Hellboy explains that he hates them because they never get the eyes right. And that's when we are introduced to an adult Hellboy played by Ron Perlman. The guard then says that while Hellboy is technically in his 60s by human years, he doesn't age like normal people, so he's really in his 20s.
They didn't mention at any point how long he's expected to live for.
No, I don't think anybody knows because he's, a demonic being and he's one of a kind in the world.
Interesting.
So let's see. I think his name is Agent Moss. That's the gentleman who takes him into the vault. So then John Myers introduces himself to Hellboy, and John asks Moss about Hellboy's horns. And Moss says that he files them down. And then we see Hellboy take a large sander and he takes it to its horns and he starts to file them down. Then an alarm suddenly goes off in the entire lab, and Hellboy says, "What do you say, John? Let's go fight some monsters." And John is just horrified. He's so not sure what he just got himself into.
I think it's so funny that they have just like regular men being alongside these monsters against monsters. Like, what?
Right.
Like, I'm
Keep
so
them out of
sad.
the news.
Like, these poor guys are gonna die.
Oh, and we will get to that. So now, as they go off to go fight some monsters, we see they're inside of a garbage truck and it's fashioned very similarly to a Mission Impossible office. But inside this garbage truck are Abe Sapien and Hellboy.
Incognito.
So they meet the rest of the team who are human at a museum. This is where they sync up and they decide that they all have these gadgets called locators. And they say, all right, it's time to sync up our locators. We then learn that there's a demon inside of the museum and that a statue from the Vatican has been basically destroyed. Abe then sticks his hand on the door and he's reading what's behind the door and says that there's a dark, evil entity that is hungry behind this door. And then Hellboy, being very arrogant, says, "Let me go say hi." He then goes inside of the vault itself, and everybody else locks the vault back behind him. And he sees a whole bunch of bodies of guards all over the floor. There are statues that are just knocked over everywhere, and there's lots of goo. I'm trying to decide if I've ever seen so much goo in a movie before. There was a lot of goo. Specifically in this scene, there was so much goo. He like wiped his hand up on this goo and it just kind of fell from his hand.
That sounds right. That sounds like a fun.
Are you being sarcastic or serious?
I'm being serious for myself, sarcastic how would well, that is. Isn't it?
They just got tubs of goo and they're just launching it at each other. It's fine.
But that worked.
So John talks to Abe, and Abe explains that Hellboy likes to do the lonely hero thing. And as we transition back to Hellboy, he finds a demon and he's hanging from the ceiling and continuing to drip more goo. When the demon then falls from the ceiling, he kind of looks like a mix of the Predator and like a Triceratops, and then he runs on all fours. So they've decided that this is a demon dog of sorts. And Hellboy suggests to the demon that they work it out peacefully and then begins to shoot until he hits the demon and he's seemingly dead. Meanwhile, they've destroyed some more property in the process. Then Abe says to Hellboy on their transmitter that he needs to hear the rest of the inscription that he's found and that the demon is a hound of resurrection. This is when the demon then, not dead, attacks Hellboy again and begins throwing him around. He's then launched out of the museum and down the side of a building, and he then lands, and there's a man standing there just ominously. This is Rasputin that we saw at the beginning of the movie, so we know that he's alive and he's coming after Hellboy. And then when Hellboy looks away, he looks back and Rasputin's just gone. That's when the demon, the Hellhound, jumps onto Hellboy, and then John comes around the building and starts shooting at the Hellhound. Of course, as the lonely hero character, Hellboy is rather annoyed and says that he likes to do this alone. They take cover. Hellboy gives him a new weapon, and then John asks what is on Hellboy's arm. And Hellboy looks at it and he's like, "I don't know. Let me go ask." I love the dialogue in this movie. It's so funny and they're just so quippy. I'm thoroughly infatuated. So the demon continues to rampage through the city, and Hellboy and John chase after it. Luckily, it's Halloween, so John just tells people that he keeps running past. Crazy costumes, huh?
I mean, yeah, but it's Halloween.
So good that it's Halloween. So Hellboy and John are trying to get through some very busy traffic, and John gets stuck in the middle of the road and then is clipped by a car. And just as he's about to get hit, Hellboy intervenes and punches down on the front of this car so hard it launches the vehicle up into the sky and over John.
Like, I get visually that looks really cool. Like, I feel like if you're trying to keep it low key, why wouldn't you just
That's not the way
grab
to
the
do it.
guy and pull him out of the way?
Because Hellboy doesn't care about the destruction that he leaves in his wake.
Obvious.
Yep. So then John is still stunned. He will not get out of the road, and I cannot figure out why. But Hellboy continues to follow the demon into the subway tunnel. Now, I'm pretty sure that this is filmed in New York or it takes place in New York. So imagine a very busy subway station, and all of a sudden a demon pops out, and you've got Hellboy there as well. So they're on the subway track line itself, and the demon jumps straight through the front of the train and tears out the door and runs all the way to the end. Hellboy decides that he's going to leap onto it, but he doesn't quite make it. So he's just hanging on as best as he can onto the front of this train. And then the conductor starts hitting him on the head with a fire extinguisher to try and get him off.
I feel like that is such a normal reaction.
I know, especially after you've already had a hellhound run through your train.
Right? Like, any monster you see.
I know. He falls off the train, incidentally, and it's really funny because all the passengers start to clap and cheer on the conductor. And as the train continues to roll over Hellboy, it's hitting him in the head constantly. It's such a dumb gag, but I love it so much. Like, it's similar to, like, when people get hit in the nuts in movies. It's just one of those silly gags that no matter how many times you've seen it, it's just so funny. So then after the train completely surpasses Hellboy, he stands up and he touches where his horns are, and they are bright red, and he's like, "Ow." And then the demon was once again on the roof, and he jumps onto Hellboy, and while Hellboy seems to be down, he grabs the train line and starts to shock himself so much that all of a sudden him and the demon on top of him start to combust into flames. Do you wanna say this line next?
I'm fireproof and you're not.
Yes. Yeah. He says it a little bit more lax than that. He's very much like a, "I'm fireproof and you're not."
Right.
And Hellboy is addicted to cigars. He has a cigar on him at, like, all times, so he takes this opportunity while the demon is on fire to light a cigar and put it in his mouth. So now over the transponder, Hellboy asks John how he's doing, and he's that he'll be home late and to tell his father not to wait up. John is very concerned by this, but Hellboy doesn't care, and he just says bye. So then we change scenes again, and we see several people in costumes. They're enjoying Halloween, and we're then introduced to a psychiatric hospital. This is where we see Selma Blair. She's in a lineup of women, and one of the women in the back of the line says that there's something outside. And Selma Blair knows what this could be. So she then heads outside and she sees Hellboy hanging around one of the statues. She then sees Hellboy's arm, and she's very concerned about this arm. And he just says that he wanted to see her. Then we change scenes again. We see FBI agent Tom Manning from the TV, and Broom. Tom is not having it. He says he doesn't know how much longer he can keep lying and is annoyed by the sheer number of escapes that Hellboy has had. This is where we find out that Abe has this magical ability to be able to pick up a piece of evidence and see what happened around that piece of evidence just by touching it. So he takes off one of his gloves. He picks up a piece of rock, it seems like. And then all of a sudden, Tom is like, wait, you can't touch that. And Abe is very stone faced, very straightforward. He's like, don't worry about fingerprints. I've never had any. And then he suddenly gets very concerned and he's like, they were here. And Broom asks Abe to show him what he means. So he also has this ability to handle something, see the past, the future, the present about what happened with this something. And then also by putting somebody else's hand on top of it and putting his hand on top of theirs, he can show them exactly what happened. So he puts Broom's hand underneath his, and they go back in time to earlier in that evening. Here we see that Iron Mask is in the museum and he silently kills a few guards. And then the blonde woman from earlier, the lover of Rasputin, comes into the scene. And as Iron Mask splits a glass case in half, she grabs a tube of sand from inside that case.
You hear that?
Yes.
What the-
Now you're fine. Oh, now more guards are showing up and they start to go after Iron Mask, but this has absolutely no effect on Iron Mask as he kills them all. Then Rasputin shows up. He's dressed very sharply, might I add, but for whatever reason, he's wearing sunglasses no matter where he goes. Reminds me of Corey Hart's sunglasses at night, like very 80s cool.
Oh, yeah.
His love then starts to pour out the sand that's located in this glass jar, and he stands over it. He then puts his hand on top of the sand mound, and this is how the demon was conjured. We then come back to the present, and the professor starts to walk away, says he's all right, but then he starts to bend over, and Abe comes over to help. He puts his hand on him, and then he says, oh, you're very sick, aren't you? Broom states that he doesn't want Hellboy to know. So then we come back to Hellboy and Liz, who's Selma Blair's character, and they are sitting outside, and Hellboy is explaining what's been going on and asks her to come back to the lab with him. She exclaims that she hasn't had an episode in months and that she's starting to control her flame powers and that she's not afraid anymore. This is where we find out that Liz is a fire starter. So then the guards / nanny squad of Hellboys show up. She says that if he really cared about her, he wouldn't come back. So just as John gets to Hellboy, he drops to his knees in pain. Hellboy does. And then they realize that Hellboy has lost a lot of blood, and the guards start to walk him to the car. This is where John looks back at Liz and they exchange a longing look. We're about to have a love triangle.
Yeah.
So now we're back to the lab, and Hellboy's on a surgery table with Abe looking at Hellboy's wounds, and he pulls out 3 eggs. John asks if Hellboy ever lost track of the demon, and he claims that he only lost him for a couple of seconds. And then it's exclaimed that they need to go back and find all the eggs because this demon is reproducing and it's reproducing quickly. So after this is all said and done, John looks up who Liz is, and he finds a recording of her explaining her fire starter / pyrokinesis powers. This is how you can understand that he's starting to fall even more in love with her because she's not like the other girls.
Clearly.
We're then transitioned back to the psych hospital where the orderly is doing checks and Liz is asleep in her bed. The orderly then closes the door after he's checked on her, and Rasputin shows up. He then kisses her forehead where she has a scar. We flash back to a dream where she was a kid and some kids were being very mean and they threw a rock at her. And this is how she got that scar. And this is one of the first instances that we can assume that she shut out blazes of fire and she caused a giant explosion. So then we return to real time where she's in her bed and suddenly she begins to light a blaze and causes another explosion at the hospital itself. We then return back to Hellboy's room And Hellboy explains that she needs to come back. Like, how many buildings are going to blow up because of this? And John says that he thinks he can bring her back if he goes and talks to her. We break to John telling the professor that he doesn't think that he's right for the job. And then Broom says that he's dying and that Rasputin is back. John is the only person who's right for this job because he's pure of heart and he needs to be there for Hellboy after Broom dies. And then we change scenes again. John is at a facility where Liz is in a padded room. He's talking to a nurse outside of an observation panel, and she says that she was doing so well. And ever since the incident, she's been sitting facing the wall and just hasn't been saying or doing anything. So John goes into the room and he asks her to come with him. And then we do another scene change. There's a lot of scene changes in this
There
movie.
is no change. This movie sounds good. It's a good
It
one.
does. See, and that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this movie. It picks up pace real fast. So Abe and Hellboy and some of the guards are back into the subway tunnels, and Abe is using his hands to detect where all the eggs are. He locates them and says that they're behind a brick wall. And while the guards and the FBI agents think that it's going to take them so long to get through this wall, Hellboy just takes his arm and he starts punching through the wall. So as we investigate the tunnels further, we then come to see that Iron Mask is in the tunnels as well, and he's fixing up one of his masks, and he can hear the banging of Hellboy punching the wall. So after Hellboy successfully punches through the wall, the gang of FBI misfits gets through the wall, and Hellboy finds a manhole cover and he lifts it up. This is where Abe is going to go underwater and take a dip, essentially. They are pretty sure that this is where the eggs are. Above the manhole cover, Hellboy and one of the guards, I believe this is Moss again, are putting out glow sticks and they're looking for the eggs. And then all of a sudden, Iron Mask shows up. As soon as he shows up, Hellboy chases after him and they are, Iron Mask is taking them all throughout the tunnels. So then we transition back to Abe underwater and he finds stacks of eggs. He has a vial, but he's dropped it. And so then he tries to grab this vial again. But one of the demon hounds shows up behind him and they start chasing Abe. Abe then wedges himself within a small tunnel and then he's constantly being attacked by this demon. At some point in time, the demon actually does scratch him and he is eventually able to get away, though. So he's okay. So back above the manhole cover, there are still two FBI members standing guard of the manhole cover. And then they find that two demons have also come out of the manhole and are pacing around the opening. Unfortunately, these demons attack the two FBI men and they are killed. So Moss, who went after Iron Mask with Hellboy, says that he can't find him, and Hellboy is just continuing to run through the tunnels. This is where he runs into Iron Mask's lair, and he sees all of the accoutrement that he has there. His various masks, some books, music playing. As Hellboy's looking around the lair, he sees an inscription that resurrects the demon, and then he looks up and he sees one of the demon hounds above him. And this is where he says, "Didn't I kill you already?" The demon, per usual, jumps on him and they crash into the subway platform. They begin to fight, and then a phone starts ringing, and Hellboy grabs it off the wall and starts beating the demon and says, "It's for you," as they're on the subway platform with bunches of people around them. They continue to fight, and the demon launches at Hellboy. And as they stand there for a moment, the overhead room falls on top of Hellboy. Hellboy gets back up from the rubble. They fight some more. And just then, as Hellboy is about to finish off this demon, a woman starts asking for help about her box of kittens.
Oh my god, that woman. I'm like, of all the things that are going on right now, woman, your kittens are like least of everyone's problem. And then also, it's like you cared about them that much, you should have gone and grabbed them yourself. They were like 5 feet away from her.
What I can't understand is why do you have a box of kittens in a Subway? I'm so lost by that. But
Who knows? Maybe
luckily, luckily Hellboy has a soft spot for cats, and so he grabs the box, and just as the demon launches his tongue out at Hellboy, he stops the attack by wrapping the tongue around his forearm and swinging the demon around and through a window. The demon is then hanging, and it's on the roof of the subway, and all of a sudden it gets hit by a subway, by a train. Hellboy then finally gets up and he gives the woman back her kittens.
they
So
were
then
puppies with being goners.
we come back to Abe and he's gotten out of the water, but he's all cut up. Then we see Moss back in the tunnels and he's still lost. He has no idea where Hellboy went, where anybody is, and he's calling for help, but nobody's answering because they're already dead. And Iron Mask shows up and he turns a dial on his suit. And then all of a sudden, Moss starts to shoot Iron Mask, and where the bullets pierced his suit, sand starts to spill out. And unfortunately, this is not enough to stop Iron Mask, so Iron Mask starts to attack Moss, and he stabs him several times in the stomach until he's died. So, as Iron Mask knows that Hellboy is showing up, he turns the dial again, and then he starts to seize. Hellboy shows up to both of their bodies just unmoving on the floor. And he asks where everybody is, but nobody's answering because once again, they're already dead. And then he keeps saying that he needs an ambulance. From there, we have another scene change where they're all back at the laboratory at home base. And Hellboy is standing next to Abe, who's recovering. FBI agent Tom Manning says that Hellboy is reckless and that no matter what, there will always be a monster. That monster is him. So Hellboy grabs Tom Manning and he throws him into a giant water heater. This is where Liz shows up with John just as the windows start to shatter and she just sees that nothing's changed. Hellboy comes out of the room and he is ecstatic to see her there. He could not be happier. So, as her and John and the rest of them go off into their separate ways, we're then transitioned into Hellboy's room. There are cats everywhere, and he's trying to write a message to Liz. Just as he's trying to figure out what to say in his letter, Liz enters the room and she lets him know that she's going out for coffee with John. And Hellboy is not too happy about that. So we do another scene change, and luckily they have taken Iron Mask's body back with them. And Broom is decided to do an autopsy of Iron Mask. He starts to see that Iron Mask was at one point in time a person, but he had a very masochistic drive to do surgery on himself, and that the blood has dried up years ago. Now we transition back to Liz and John getting coffee, and John talks about Hellboy, and Liz says that she grew up with him and she thinks of him every day. Little do they know that Hellboy is close behind them and basically stalking them as he leaps from the building to make sure that he can oversee their date because he's very jealous. As he's spying, he sees Liz take John's picture and he cannot fathom that she took his picture. He starts to obsess over this. He's like, she took his picture. She took his picture. He leaps to another building, but he almost doesn't make it. And just as he's pulling himself onto the roof, he finds that there's a teenager on the roof with some pigeons.
I love that scene. It's so cute.
He's just like, oh, you're Hellboy.
Well, then he doesn't like just like fanboy over him. He's
I know.
casual and friendly.
He's like, cool. Hellboy tells the boy that he's on a mission and to not tell anybody. So then we transition back to the scene with Broom. He's analyzing some of the torn up pieces that Iron Mask had in his pockets, and the paper says something about seeing Moscow. Now we transition back to Iron Mask, who was on the autopsy table, and he sits straight up. So he's clearly not dead. He puts himself back together and he gets dressed. And now we transition back to Hellboy and the teenager. The teenager gives Hellboy some cookies, and then Hellboy picks up a rock or two from the top of the roof and he flings it straight at John's forehead. What makes me laugh is he doesn't even duck. He's just hanging out, waiting to see if John notices him.
Right? Like, how do they not notice him? If it was
I
like a
have no
regular
idea.
person, then that makes sense that they missed him. But this is like literally a giant red devil. How do you not see it in the corner of your eye?
Right? Oh my goodness. So John stands up immediately, and yells out in pain, and he's looking around. And he's like, "Who threw that?" Obviously, not seeing Hellboy on the roof. And the teenager says, "Nice shot." Then we transition back to the lab, and Broom is researching what happened to Iron Mask. And then all of a sudden, he hears Iron Mask coming down the spiral staircase from the autopsy room. Broom requests that since he now sees the puppet, he wants to know where the puppeteer is. And Rasputin is sitting right behind him. Rasputin says he will give the professor a brief glimpse of the future. So as he puts his hand on Broom's head, Broom then sees scenes of red and a destroyed world and a silhouette of Hellboy with full horns. Rasputin claims that this is the true future and that Hellboy will open up the portal again and bring about the end of the world. He says that Broom's god chooses to be silent while Rasputin's god got closer to him every time he died, and that there's a monster that lives within him. Broom turns around and says he's ready as Iron Mask impales him in the spinal cord and Broom falls to the ground. That's the end of Broom.
But at least they killed off someone who was already dying anyway.
Right, exactly. And I think that was part of the reason why he wanted to go out like that. He didn't want to die by whatever disease he had because that would just be too sad for Hellboy, but if he dies at the hand of whatever they're fighting, that's a little bit more, I don't know, honorable as a way to go out, I suppose.
Like,
So we transition back to the teenager and Hellboy, and the teenager is trying to give Hellboy some advice, and he says, "Just tell her how you feel. That's what my mom says." And Hellboy retorts that, "What do you know? You're like 9." And this is suddenly when some cars show up to John and Liz while they're on their coffee date. And Hellboy knows that something is wrong just based off of the way that they're reacting to the news. And they've all returned to the lab. This is where Hellboy finds out that Broom is dead. And there are crime scene photos being taken and placards everywhere. But Hellboy just walks straight to Broom's corpse and he holds him tightly. Then we cut to Broom's funeral, and of course, it's raining. And John is one of the pallbearers for Broom's casket. Liz is watching the coffin be loaded up into a hearse, and as she looks up, Hellboy is standing on top of what looks to be a walkway that is over the hearse itself. Hellboy then holds his father's rosary, and Liz is talking to Abe, and she's voicing her concerns about Hellboy's not being able to eat or sleep. She asks if she should stay with him. Abe gives her a riddle essentially as an answer. He says he's no good at puzzles. He can't even solve two sides of a Rubik's cube, but he does know that if there's trouble, that all they can have is each other. He asks that she take care of Hellboy while he can't. Then we transition to an FBI briefing, and Tom Manning speaks to what Broom was researching, says that they're going to go to Moscow. and they realize that not all of the eggs have been destroyed. So Liz walks past the boardroom and into the library, and she finds Hellboy. She says that she's happy to go to Moscow if he is. And Hellboy says that they're still going and understands that he's too different and that he understands that Meyer can make her feel normal, basically subverting this love triangle. And then he says he knows two things. He'll always look this good and he'll never give up on her. And she replies with the idea that she likes that. This is also where we find out that the Hell Demon has a rule, essentially. It's kind of like a hydra, where if one falls, two shall rise in its place. We see the whole gang on a plane, and one of the FBI agents brings out some of the weaponry that they're expected to use during this mission, specifically a grenade. This is a very powerful grenade. I can't tell you all that it does, but I know that it's very powerful. And now they're in Moscow. Ironically enough, they got to keep Hellboy incognito still. So he's in a crate in the back of a truck. Then, when they reach their destination, they see that it's a giant cemetery. This is where they decide that they're looking for Rasputin's grave. And Hellboy says that he'll ask for directions. And of course, everybody looks very confused when he says this. So he pulls out some kind of device, Hellboy does, and he says, "Give me a talker. Give me a talker." And so he's pointing this device. It kind of looks like a metal detector or something. And he comes across a grave and it starts to beep. And he's like, okay. And he opens up this grave. He jumps into the pit. He lifts up the coffin top and he spins a pendulum over the body and says some words. The corpse then wakes up and asks, presumably in Russian, "What do you want?"
That little corpse thingy reminded me so much of the one from Sponge
Ah,
Chocolate.
oh, I forgot about that. Oh my God. That's awesome. So Hellboy attaches the top half of the corpse, who we now are introduced to as Ivan, and he basically gives them a piggyback ride and asks for directions. So Ivan tells them that there's a network of tunnels, and Hellboy advises them to stay close. Of course, as Hellboy states that they'll be all right as long as they don't get separated, they walk straight into a booby trap where walls launch up from the ground, separating the whole group into smaller groups, and then spikes fall down from the walls. So there's no turning back. Here's where Hellboy says that they need to turn on their locators, and John isn't so sure about this. But Hellboy says that Liz will take care of him. So all the groups separate and they move forward since they can't go back. First, we go with Hellboy, Ivan, and Tom, and one other random FBI agent. Hellboy gives Ivan to the random FBI agent, and the door starts to close behind them. So they can't go back again. They can only continue to move forward. Here is where Tom starts to really rag on Hellboy. He's yelling at him. He's like, "We need to go back. I'm in charge and we need to go back." And just as that starts to happen, a giant mallet swings down and hits the bridge that they're standing on. And all of a sudden, Ivan and the random FBI agent go swinging out. And
For a random FBI agent.
then Hellboy, seeing that the mallet is returning, throws Tom down the rest of the bridge and heads that way himself as the door on the other side of the bridge begins to close. Very reminiscent of the mummy.
Yes, that does remind me.
So they start to hear music and they walk towards it. And of course, the hallway that they're going down is coated in spikes, and Tom cuts himself on one. And this alerts Iron Mask at the end of the hallway of their presence. He takes off, but Hellboy and Tom enter the room. They turn off the music, and suddenly Iron Mask is back in their faces. Hellboy blocks Iron Mask from killing Tom and grabs him, punches him repeatedly in the face, and launches him across the room. Iron Mask starts laughing, and Hellboy's like, "What are you laughing at?" And then all of a sudden, the floor opens up to reveal a pit of spikes. Luckily, Hellboy has quick reflexes and he grabs a rope and manages not to fall in. This is where Iron Mask decides that he's going to try and attack Hellboy, but that didn't work out so well as Hellboy grabs the end of the rope, wraps it around Iron Mask's neck, and pulls him into the pit, and he gets impaled. And then Hellboy gets out. He grabs a giant gear. Like, this gear must have been a ton, literally a ton. And he grabs it, he picks it up over his head, and he throws it on top of Iron Mask to keep him where the spikes are. He's not getting out of there anytime soon. So then Hellboy celebrates by going to light a cigar.
Has an endless amount of cigars on him.
And then Tom, this is where they have a good bonding moment. Hellboy has saved Tom's life. So Tom will then tell him that he needs to use a match to light his cigar because it helps preserve the flavor. And then they thank each other. I think they're on a good truce level now. So then we transition to Liz and John. And John finally figures out that Hellboy thinks that they're a bit of an item,
2 days ago.
right? He had no idea. He was absolutely clueless. But this is where Liz says, "Men are all the same." Very true. So after traversing the tunnel, they reach an opening of a downed statue and several of the demon hounds and their demon eggs all over this room. Of course, per usual, the tunnel then gets closed off and the demons begin to close in on Liz and John. Liz calls Hellboy and he starts to punch the floor until he can create an opening. Suddenly, there are all three of them again, and Hellboy starts kicking some of these demon hounds' asses. Meanwhile, we start to see that the eggs are hatching, so there's very little time for anything at this point. Hellboy is taking on too many demons at once, and Liz says that they need to do something. And she asks John to hit her. And he's like, "What? I'm not doing that." And she's like, "No, I need you to hit me." After he slaps her, she starts to become inflamed. So flames start to circle around her body. And as they do, they become stronger and stronger until she spreads flames across the entire room and decimates the demons and the eggs and everything else in her path. John luckily took cover and he starts waking up from having passed out from the explosion and he sees Rasputin and the woman that he always has with him talking. They have unfortunately grabbed the grenade belt from him and then we see that he's also chained to a rock. We then turn to Hellboy, who seems to be in the middle of like an altar and he's chained down. And across the room, Liz is laying seemingly naked on some kind of stone altar.
Why?
And
I'm like, why is she naked?
I know, I'm like, how did this happen? Why does it need to be that she's naked?
What is going on? What?
No idea. That's just how Rasputin likes them. So Rasputin starts reading an incantation. His lover says that Hellboy is the key, the bringer of doom, and she encourages him to imagine an Eden for him and Liz. And Hellboy says that he won't do it. He won't do what they want. And so from there, they say, "All right, well, we're going to kill Liz." And Rasputin starts to go over to her. He looks like he's about to make out with her, but instead starts to suck out her soul, essentially. And this is where Hellboy starts to struggle with his chains. After successfully sucking out her soul, Rasputin says that her soul awaits on the other side, and all he has to do is open the door to the other side. An eclipse begins, and Rasputin goes over to Hellboy and instructs him that all he has to do is say his true name to become the key. Hellboy, beaten down emotionally, finally gives in, and Rasputin speaks another incantation. Hellboy repeats it in turn, and the chains become unlocked. His horns begin to grow into a fiery blaze, and the sky turns red. Rasputin and his lover are very pleased about this, and they watch him walk towards the keyhole, which is in a giant door across the room. He begins to stick his arm in it and turn, and this shoots a beam of fire into the sky, which transcends over the other world that we had seen previously at the beginning of the movie. It hits the previous crystal that holds various monsters in it. John has so much blood on his hands that even though he's chained to a rock, he's able to slip his hand through his handcuff. From there, he grabs Hellboy's rosary that had fallen onto the floor and he yells at Hellboy to remember who he is and he throws him the rosary. The rosary burns across into Hellboy's hand. This enrages Rasputin's lover and she goes to smash in his head, but John trips her and then gets up and tells Hellboy that he still has a choice. Rasputin denies this, but Hellboy takes his horns and he tears them off. Like, full on just grabs them. And I'm trying to think of what this would equate to, as if they were spaghetti, like he just grabs the hold of his horns, rips them in half as if they were just spaghetti strands. So Rasputin is outraged at this. Hellboy then takes his newly formed weapon that was once his horn and he stabs Rasputin right into the stomach. And Rasputin then claims to Hellboy that he will never understand his destiny. And Hellboy says that he's fine with that. He doesn't want it. He goes and he grabs Liz's body off the altar. And as Liz, John, and Hellboy walk out, the monster, the kraken that was in the other dimension, begins to grow out of Rasputin's stomach. He dies sitting up against a pillar, and his lover comes over. She kisses him and is just so happy to die with him right in that moment. So Hellboy and John and Liz make it into the tunnel, and Hellboy says John needs to take care of her because Hellboy is about to go kick some ass. So John throws Hellboy the grenade belt that he's recovered. And just when Hellboy says, "How big can it be?" a giant tentacle wraps around him and pulls him through the tunnel. So this is where Hellboy begins the battle with the big boss. Using a sword, he begins slicing off tentacles as best as he can until the kraken begins to fling him from tentacle to tentacle. Hellboy then pulls the pin of the grenade belt just before the kraken eats him, and the kraken blows up once again, goo going everywhere.
Oh, good everywhere.
Hellboy then retreats back to John and Liz, but Liz doesn't have a pulse. Here is where we find out that Hellboy apparently has magic powers as he whispers in Liz's ear and her soul returns and she wakes up. She gets up and she hugs Hellboy very tightly, saying that in the dark, she heard his voice. He tells her that he said, "Hey, you on the other side, let her go, because I will cross over and then you'll be sorry." The two of them kiss and she becomes inflamed and the flames wrap around them together. John watches and he looks incredibly sad.
And poor John.
We end the movie returning back to the phrase at the beginning of the movie, what makes a man? A man. Not how he starts things, but how he ends them. And that's the end of the movie.
Just like, I'm just going to be referencing other movies.
I've done it about 3 times now.
In The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
What makes a monster and what makes him, and they do it both at the beginning and the
Oh,
yeah.
dude.
The little clown. I forgot his name. I want to say Jean-Claude, but that's probably not right.
The Jester. I think Jean-Claude is the prince guy, isn't he?
I have no idea.
I got nothing. I haven't seen that movie in like 20 years. So,
A little while, but not 20 years.
oh,
Like a year or two.
I believe you had told me about it. I remember I used to have like an Esmeralda doll. With that, how do you think the movie went?
I think for the time, it must have been a super fun, action-packed, great movie for the family. That's what I think of it. And as far as I definitely do not agree with the dislike review, uh, but I also don't care. like, like I don't know why, but even as you were like reading it, I could not remember any of that happening. This movie just like no hold over me at all. I don't know what it is, but what is this person? I crave Hellboy. I don't feel the same way, girl. I'm assuming that.
Yeah, I think
I don't know.
the last time I actually watched this movie prior to us doing it for the podcast itself, I think it had been like 15 years, which is saying something because I'm really not that old.
Long time.
I know. I do really enjoy this movie, and I will say that unfortunately my retelling of it doesn't do it justice because honestly there are so many good quippy lines that you have to actually watch and like take in how Ron Perlman says them. But I will say like I think it's a good movie. I don't think it's a 10 out of 10. Like I would probably rate it like a 6. You know, it has been almost 20 years since it came out, but the makeup is amazing, the
Oh, okay.
costumes are amazing, the
Makeup.
Mhm.
I'm sure that's what they won awards for. Like
I just love this movie, and I think that to really encapsulate the humor of it, you just have to kinda watch it for yourself. So, I hope that this has sparked some desire to go watch it because I think it's well worth it. Especially if you like superhero movies or comic book movies, you gotta
yeah.
throw this in your rotation. Well, I guess if there's nothing else, thank you all so much for listening. This is our second episode ever, so greatly appreciate the patience with it. And follow us on Instagram. That's the only social media that we have thus far. And from there, you'll get to know when we drop new episodes and what's coming up next. So without further ado, catch you on the flick side.
Catch you on the flick side.